I'm sure there are things I could do better. I'm sure there are things I could have said better.
The moment Joni Lamb's latest interview went live, the internet lit up, and not in her favor. What was meant to be another bold conversation quickly spiraled into chaos, as viewers from every corner of social media began flooding the comments with outrage, disappointment, and shock. Longtime fans are questioning her motives, critics are seizing the moment, and the backlash is fiercer than anything she's faced before. Could this be the moment that changes her legacy forever? When Joni Lamb stepped into that interview, everything about it screamed redemption. The promos promised viewers the chance to finally see the real Joni, the woman behind the headlines, the one who had endured loss and controversy and was ready to bare her soul. From the very beginning, it was clear this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. It was a carefully planned performance, a moment designed to reset her image. She walked in composed, her voice steady, her words deliberate, but instead of drawing people closer, the interview only managed to push them away. She began with the familiar parts of her story, her childhood, her faith, the battles she had faced, and the way she had leaned on God for strength. She spoke of adversity and framed her journey as one of divine calling, where every hardship was part of a larger plan. It sounded polished, almost too polished, like lines rehearsed for weeks. As she shared, her eyes welled with tears and her voice cracked at just the right moments. But rather than inspiring sympathy, many viewers felt they were watching a script unfold. When the questions turned to the more sensitive topics, the remarriage, the family tensions, the whispers of scandal, Joni's composure shifted. Instead of opening up, she circled back to her faith and painted herself as a victim misunderstood by the world. Viewers wanted raw honesty, but what they got was deflection. The timing of her tears felt strategic, as if each breakdown was less about grief and more about swaying public opinion. By the middle of the interview, social media was already lighting up. Audiences weren't buying it. Many said she looked like she was dodging the truth, hiding behind religious phrases and emotional appeals while refusing to touch the real issues. Every time she leaned into her narrative of being guided by God's plan, people saw it as another attempt to excuse her choices. By the time the cameras shut off, what was supposed to be Joni's moment of redemption had become the opposite. Instead of repairing her image, she left viewers more doubtful than ever. The polished act, the missing answers, the carefully chosen words, it all backfired. The interview didn't show the real Joni. It showed someone fighting to control the story, and that left her audience colder than before. Marriage, grief, and doubts have always been complicated enough on their own, but when they collide in the life of a public figure like Joni Lamb, the storm becomes impossible to hide. From the outside, it all looked like a story of resilience. A woman who had lost her husband, found herself in the depths of sorrow, and then stepped into a new chapter of love and partnership. But for those watching closely, the timeline and the choices raised far more questions than answers, turning what could have been a tale of healing into one of suspicion and doubt. When Marcus Lamb passed, the Christian community felt the loss deeply. He wasn't just a husband and father, he was the co-founder of a massive ministry, a familiar face to millions of viewers who tuned in week after week. For Joni, his death wasn't only a personal tragedy, it was also a public one. Cameras captured her grief, and tributes flooded in. People sympathized with her, believing they were watching a woman trying to navigate life after the loss of her soulmate. The expectation was that Joni would take time to heal, to process the sorrow, and to lean into her faith before even considering what came next. But less than a year later, whispers began circulating. Joni had remarried. Not only remarried, but done so with a man who was already known in the ministry world, Doug Weiss, a counselor and speaker who had his own following. The news spread quickly, and with it came an avalanche of reactions. Some congratulated her, saying she deserved happiness after such heartache. Others, however, felt uneasy. The timing seemed too fast, too abrupt, as though the grief had been bypassed rather than lived through. Joni herself spoke about her decision, often framing it as part of God's plan. She said that after prayer and reflection, she felt peace about moving forward with Doug. To her, it was a continuation of her spiritual journey, a divine reassurance that life could be rebuilt even after loss. But while her explanation might have satisfied some, it left others unsettled. How could someone who claimed to have loved so deeply move on so quickly? Was her grief genuine? Or was it wrapped up in appearances? Her emotional displays only added to the confusion. During interviews, Joni often broke down when talking about Marcus, shedding tears and recalling their decades together. Yet those same interviews sometimes pivoted seamlessly into her new marriage, as if grief and new love could coexist without contradiction. For many, this contrast felt dissonant. It wasn't that people denied her the right to love again. It was the speed, the optics, and the way her explanations felt rehearsed that sparked doubt. The doubts didn't end with the remarriage itself. Rumors began swirling about when the relationship with Doug had actually begun. Some speculated that their closeness predated Marcus's death, though no concrete evidence ever surfaced. Still, in the court of public opinion, timing mattered as much as fact. Booking a honeymoon less than a year after losing her husband only fueled the perception that her grief was more performative than authentic. Viewers and supporters started asking themselves if Joni's tears were for Marcus or for the image of a grieving widow she was trying to maintain. Inside the ministry, the remarriage created ripples too. Staff and family members were divided, some supportive, others critical. Joni leaned heavily on the narrative that God had orchestrated everything, but that explanation didn't settle the unease. Faith could explain many things, but for critics, it didn't erase the sense that something was being hidden. Over time, the backlash grew louder. Social media became a battleground where supporters defended her right to love again, while critics accused her of disrespecting Marcus's memory. The sincerity of her grief was questioned, and with it, the authenticity of her leadership. For a woman who had built her platform on faith and transparency, the perception of secrecy and contradiction was damaging. What became clear was that this wasn't just about one marriage ending and another beginning, it was about trust. People who once looked at Joni as a symbol of integrity began to wonder if she was more focused on controlling her image than living authentically. Every denial, every polished answer, every appeal to God's plan added layers of doubt instead of clarity. In the end, Joni's story of marriage, grief, and doubts became less about the events themselves and more about the way they were handled. People don't expect perfection, but they do expect honesty, especially from those who lead ministries built on truth. By trying to craft a narrative instead of confronting hard questions, Joni turned her personal decisions into a public controversy, and that controversy still lingers, because when grief looks like strategy and marriage looks like damage control, people struggle to believe the story being told. Family revelations and hidden tensions often start quietly, like cracks in a wall that no one notices until the whole structure begins to shift. For the Lamb family, what was once a united front, built around faith and ministry, began to unravel in ways few outsiders could have imagined. To the public, they were the picture of strength, bound together by loss, working to carry on Marcus Lamb's legacy, and leading Daystar into the future. But behind the cameras and carefully crafted statements, there was a storm brewing. The family was not only grieving, but also divided, and when the truth began to leak out, the image of harmony started to collapse. The first shock came through whispers that grew louder over time. Jonathan and Susie Lamb, Marcus and Joni's children, began to speak out. Their words weren't casual complaints or small disagreements. They were revelations that painted a very different picture of what life inside the Lamb family had been like. They described situations that went against the polished image their parents had maintained for years. The Lamb household, once portrayed as grounded in love and faith, was now being described as fractured, with secrets long buried suddenly being dragged into the light. Jonathan's leaked audio recordings were perhaps the most jarring. In them, he spoke openly about his frustrations with his mother, Joni. He accused her of manipulating narratives, of prioritizing image over truth, and of ignoring problems that should have been confronted. These weren't vague criticisms. They were raw, emotional, and filled with the kind of honesty that comes only when someone reaches a breaking point. Hearing Marcus and Joni's own son question his mother's integrity was enough to make people pause. If the child of the family was saying this, what did it mean for the rest of the story? Susie also added her voice, backing up Jonathan's claims and revealing her own struggles within the family dynamic. She spoke about times when loyalty to the ministry seemed to outweigh loyalty to one another, when appearances were valued more than addressing deep-rooted issues. Her words gave weight to the idea that the family's troubles weren't recent, but had been simmering for years. Hidden behind the success of Daystar, one of the most painful revelations was the allegation that abuse within the family had been covered up. Jonathan and Susie claimed that Joni and Marcus had chosen silence over transparency, protecting the family's image instead of confronting hard truths. These claims, whether entirely accurate or not, shook the foundation of trust people had in the Lambs. For many supporters, the idea that such serious matters could be hidden in a family so publicly dedicated to faith felt like a betrayal. At the heart of it all was Joni, trying to hold control while her children publicly challenged her. Instead of responding with openness, she often deflected, denying the allegations outright and dismissing them as lies or misunderstandings. To viewers, this approach looked less like leadership and more like avoidance. The more she denied, the more her children's words seemed to resonate. People began to wonder if the real story was closer to what Jonathan and Susie were saying than to the polished image Joni continued to project. The tension didn't just play out in interviews or leaked recordings. It seeped into the very core of the family dynamic. Imagine a family dinner where unresolved issues hang in the air, where trust is gone, and every conversation feels like walking on glass. That was the reality many insiders described about the Lamb family. The loss of Marcus had not united them in grief as much as it had exposed old wounds and opened new ones. For the public, watching this unfold felt surreal. Daystar wasn't just a television network. It was built on the idea of family, of shared faith, of unity. Seeing the family behind it fracture in such a visible way left supporters questioning everything. Could they still trust the ministry? Could they believe the message when the messengers themselves seemed so divided? Behind the tension was something even deeper: the clash between loyalty to the past and the uncertainty of the future. Jonathan and Susie wanted transparency and change, while Joni seemed determined to preserve control, no matter the cost. Doug Weiss's sudden arrival as Joni's new husband only complicated things further. To her children, it looked like she was moving on too quickly, prioritizing her own path over the stability of the family and the ministry. That decision widened the cracks even more, turning disagreements into open wounds. The revelations also forced people to see the Lambs not as a perfect Christian family, but as humans, with flaws, mistakes, and struggles. Yet instead of humbling the narrative, Joni often doubled down, defending herself with passion but little vulnerability. This fueled the perception that she cared more about maintaining power than reconciling with her children. Each public statement she made felt like another brick in the wall separating her from Jonathan and Susie. Over time, the hidden tensions became impossible to hide. Supporters who had once been loyal to Daystar began voicing doubts, and critics found their suspicions confirmed. The Lamb family, once admired for their faith and unity, now looked like a family in collapse. And for Joni, who had hoped her interview and public appearances would repair her image, the opposite happened. The family revelations overshadowed her narrative, leaving her looking isolated, defensive, and disconnected. In the end, the Lamb family's hidden tensions became their most public story. What had started as private struggles turned into headlines, podcasts, and viral discussions. The family revelations not only damaged Joni's personal reputation, but also shook the credibility of Daystar itself. For many, it was no longer just about what Joni had done or denied. It was about a family that had once symbolized faith, now standing as a reminder of how quickly secrets and silence can tear everything apart. Denials, scandals, and a shaken legacy. It's a story that feels almost larger than life, yet it unfolded in front of the public in a way that no one could ignore. For years, Joni Lamb had been seen as a steady hand in Christian broadcasting, someone who helped build a ministry empire alongside her late husband Marcus. But when the spotlight turned on her, when the whispers became louder and the questions more pressing, her responses didn't bring peace or reassurance. Instead, her denials, the growing list of scandals, and the way she chose to handle them began to unravel the very legacy she worked so hard to preserve. The pattern was simple but devastating. A new allegation would surface, Joni would deny it outright, and instead of calming the storm, her denial only poured gasoline on the fire. Each denial came across as dismissive, as if the questions weren't worth her time, as if the viewers and critics raising them were simply liars or enemies out to destroy her. At first, some supporters gave her the benefit of the doubt. They believed she was under attack and admired her strength in standing firm. But as more and more details emerged, from her remarriage to Doug Weiss to the leaked audio recordings of her son Jonathan to the financial and abuse allegations, the denials began to feel hollow. The remarriage was the first scandal that truly shook people's trust. Marcus Lamb's death was still fresh in the minds of the audience when Joni revealed she had married Doug, a man she claimed God had placed in her life. She spoke about grief and healing, but the timeline didn't add up. Viewers were quick to notice that only months had passed before she was not only in a new relationship, but already married. When pressed about it, she denied any impropriety, denied that it was too soon, denied that anything about it was questionable. But people weren't convinced. The denial didn't erase the unease. It made it worse. Then came the family revelations. Jonathan and Susie Lamb spoke out in ways that no one expected. Jonathan's leaked recordings revealed a side of the story that contradicted Joni's polished image. He accused her of manipulation, of using faith as a shield for her decisions, of prioritizing control over transparency. Susie added her own voice, backing up his claims and describing hidden tensions within the family. These weren't outsiders or critics speaking. They were her own children. Yet Joni denied their words, brushing them aside as lies or misunderstandings. For the public, this was harder to ignore. After all, who knows a mother better than her children? The denial only deepened the suspicion. As if that wasn't enough, the allegations of abuse cover-ups struck at the very core of trust. Jonathan and Susie claimed there had been incidents of abuse within the Lamb family that had been hidden to protect the ministry's image. These were heavy accusations, ones that demanded transparency and accountability. Instead, Joni denied everything. She insisted she knew nothing, that the claims were false, that her family was the target of a smear campaign. But her refusal to even acknowledge the seriousness of the issue left people unsettled. Silence and dismissal in the face of such claims felt like avoidance. The denials again failed to calm the storm, they fueled it. The financial controversies piled on next. Documents surfaced suggesting ministry funds had been used for personal expenses, even for Joni's honeymoon with Doug Weiss. Once again, Joni denied it, saying she had paid for everything herself, that the charges had been cleared. But the timing, the optics, and the tone of her defense left many skeptical. The ministry, once seen as a beacon of faith, was now under scrutiny for mismanagement and questionable spending. Joni's denials here weren't just about her personal reputation. They threatened the credibility of the entire network. Each scandal alone might have been survivable. With careful honesty and genuine humility, she could have acknowledged mistakes, asked for forgiveness, and rebuilt trust. But instead, she chose the path of blanket denial. Every challenge was labeled as lies, every question dismissed, every critic painted as an enemy. Over time, this approach created a sense of distance between Joni and her audience. Viewers didn't see a woman humbly grappling with mistakes. They saw someone deflecting, refusing to face reality, and protecting her image at all costs. The public backlash grew louder. Social media lit up with criticism. Hashtags trended and comment sections filled with frustration. People weren't just questioning Joni. They were questioning Daystar itself. Could a network led by someone so unwilling to face hard truths really be trusted? For longtime supporters, this was heartbreaking. They had believed in Marcus and Joni's vision. They had supported the ministry for years. Now they were forced to wrestle with the possibility that what they had believed in wasn't what it seemed. The more Joni tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped out of her hands. Her emotional breakdowns on camera, once seen as heartfelt, began to look staged. Her claims of victimhood, once sympathetic, began to sound rehearsed. The contradictions in her words, like saying she hadn't watched podcasts or videos about her, while her team created responses to them, made her look dishonest. Even those who wanted to defend her found it harder and harder to explain away the inconsistencies, and so the legacy began to shake. For years, Joni had been part of building something powerful, something that reached millions. She had carried on Marcus's dream, expanded Daystar's influence, and carved her own place in the world of Christian broadcasting. But legacies are fragile, built not just on accomplishments but on trust. And trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. Each denial chipped away at that trust. Each scandal cracked the foundation a little more, and eventually, the image that had seemed so strong began to crumble. Dean, Dr. Lee, actor. Inside the ministry, insiders described chaos. Staff members were exhausted from constant crisis control, from rewriting statements, from scrambling to put out fires. Some quietly left, unwilling to be part of a machine that seemed more focused on damage control than on truth. Others stayed, but admitted privately that the sense of mission and unity that had once defined Daystar was gone. The scandals weren't just damaging Joni, they were damaging everyone connected to her. The saddest part of it all is that it didn't have to be this way. If Joni had chosen honesty over denial, transparency over control, she might have saved both her reputation and the ministry's. People are often willing to forgive mistakes, even big ones, if they feel they're being told the truth. But when denial is the only answer, when every scandal is brushed aside as lies, forgiveness becomes impossible. Now, Joni's legacy stands at a crossroads. To some, she will always be remembered as the woman who carried on Marcus's vision, who built a global ministry, who spoke with passion and conviction. But to others, her name will forever be tied to scandal, denial, and a refusal to face the truth. And perhaps the most haunting question is this: what could her legacy have been if she had chosen a different path? In the end, the story of Joni Lamb is not just about a woman facing scandals. It's about what happens when denial becomes the default response to truth. It's about the way a legacy, carefully built over decades, can be shaken in just a few short years. It's about how trust, once lost, rarely returns. And it's a warning not just for Joni, but for anyone who tries to protect an image instead of confronting reality. Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, no amount of denial can stop it.